What's up everybody, Jason from Jason's Exotic Reptiles back at you with another video. This video is going to be the most complete boa care video on YouTube. If that's the video that you're looking for, stick around because this is the one for you. Before we dive too deep into the video, I want to show off this guy. This guy is a boa imperator and he is a blood boa. This specific one here is a paradox boa, and what I mean by paradox, it has a morph and the normal wild type pattern showing through. It's going to be hard to see on camera because he's not a significant paradox, but you can see right there, there's that silverish color which is the base boa imperator color, combined with the blood morph. This video is not going to get into the morphs. We're going to talk really about care and husbandry, and because morphs don't really play a role in that, it doesn't apply to this video. The first thing I want to cover is what type of boa. There's all kinds of boas out there. This video is going to be specific to boas like these guys. Boas in general will range from way up in the Mexican, Central American area in the Yucatan Peninsula, all the way down to about as far south as maybe middle to southern Argentina, where it starts to get fairly cold. Locale number one, which is the most common, is boa imperator or boa constrictor imperator. You will see this abbreviated as BI or BCI. It's the same thing, and boa imperator just recently got reclassified. I want to say 2017-ish or so. It was considered boa constrictor imperator. So BI is boa imperator, BCI is boa constrictor imperator, exact same snake, just different terms that people will use, and you'll still see those terms used interchangeably in scientific papers and write-ups all over the world. The next most common snake that you're going to see, or most common boa, all keeping within this boa constrictor red tail realm, is the BCC, boa constrictor constrictor. This is your Suriname, your Guyana, your Peruvians, your Brazilians. Those are all boa constrictor constrictor, or BCC or BC, as recently classified as boa constrictor. These are your true red tails, and yes, this video applies to them as well. Some other boas that are less common but are still out there quite typically in the pet trade are going to be your Hog Island boas, which are also boa imperator. They're just a different island locality. You're going to see your boa constrictor amarali, which are your Bolivian boas. Amazing boas, but certainly not as common as you would see a BCC or a BCI. The next one that you're going to see, which is becoming a lot more common, is your boa constrictor occidentalis. So these are your Argentine boas or your Argentinian boas. Those are probably about as far south as you can get in terms of the boa constrictor range. Another island variety that you're going to see somewhat often or occasionally in the pet trade are your Pearl Island boas, boa constrictor saboge. These are similar to Hog Islands, very smaller, dwarf growing. And then the last one that you're going to see, which is becoming a lot more common, are your boa sigma. Now, boa sigma is a range of different species, so this could be your Tarahumara boas, but the most common one that you're going to see are the Sonoran boas. Sonoran boas come from Sonora, Mexico, and they are about as far up north as you're going to see boas. And there's a whole bunch of other different locales in there that we don't really see very often at all. We're not going to cover those specific locales. This care video still applies to them, but I'm not going to specifically mention them. And why we talked about the locales and the different types of boas is because they do get to all different sizes. Generally, the Central American boas and the Northern Mexico boas, those are going to be your dwarf species, as well as your island boas, your Pearl Islands. Although they can still get a pretty good size, most of these species will get about 5 to 7 feet for males and about 6 to 8 feet for females. That's about the average size of a boa imperator. Now, there are always exceptions, just like you'll find that 7-foot human. 7-foot people are common, they're out there, but they're not as common as your average 6-foot or 5-foot person. That's your average size. So that's when I'm talking about average size for boas. This is about right. Now, when you get to some of the locales, specifically things like Argentine boas, Peruvian boas, those can start to break the boundaries of what your typical size would be. So your Argentine boas, they tend to get very large and heavy bodied. Your males will typically get about 6 to 9 feet. Your females will get in your 8 to 10 foot range, maybe 7 to 10 foot for a small, younger female, but in general, they get very large and heavy bodied. That applies to most of your BCCs as well. Your males will get about 6 to 8 feet, your females about 7 to 9 feet. I use a 2-foot range because there is always a bracket. So then you have things like your Tarahamaras, which are super small. Those range from 3 to 5 feet for males, 4 to 6 feet for females. Same thing for your Sonoran boas. They're also the leopard morph, but your Sonoran boas will get a little bit larger, 4 to 6 feet for males, 5 to 7 feet for females. Again, always pushing the boundaries of this. Overall, that's really important to understand because this is a good transition into enclosure size. The first most important thing to cover is what are you going to keep this snake in? Your boa enclosure. So when you're picking your boa, you should first think, do I have the space to keep this thing as an adult? Now as babies, these things are small and cute, and they can fit into something just as small as a little shoebox storage tote like this. As long as you can heat it, give them the things they need, which we're going to talk about later in this video, that's going to totally be sufficient for a little baby newborn boa. But as these guys grow, what can you keep this thing in as an adult? I generally recommend all throughout the growth phase, 1 square foot of floor space per foot of snake. So an 8-foot snake generally maxes out at a 4 by 2 foot enclosure. Once they break that 8-foot boundary, they really need something larger like a 6 by 2. A snake will always appreciate if you give them something larger, but at the same time you need to be very careful and cautious because the bigger the cage, the harder it is to heat, specifically when you start raising the height. Height is something that is important for boas, but they don't necessarily need it. The minimum height I recommend is usually around 1 foot. These snakes generally don't climb as they get heavier bodied as they become adults. They certainly will, but they'll spend most of their time on the ground, buried in leaves, covered with stuff like that. So the enclosure size, I would say minimum for an adult is 4 foot by 2 foot by 1 foot high. You get a small dwarf species like this, or a dwarf boa like a Tarahumara, they obviously don't need that. Will they appreciate it? Yes, but they don't need it. So a 5-foot snake would be good in something that's 3 foot by 2 foot. You guys can do the math, just do your dimensions, get your square footage, roughly measure your snake. To measure a snake, you can just take a shoelace or a piece of string, try to measure across its back, or you can put the snake up against the wall. Snakes will generally tend to go in a straight line when put up against a wall, then lay your measuring tape out and you can get a rough idea. A couple inches is not going to make a difference, so don't go crazy, just approximate. So now that we covered the locales, the snake size, and the enclosure size, one of the most important elements for these cold-blooded animals are heat. Now heat can come from a whole bunch of different sources, whether it be belly or under tank heaters, or it become overhead through use of lights or radiant heat panels or ceramic heat emitters. The way you heat your cage is going to be very specific to your cage itself. That's a whole different video topic. We're going to talk primarily about the targets that you're trying to hit. So how you heat your cage, that's up to you and your enclosure type. I specifically use racks. Obviously, I can't use lights in these racks to give off heat. I use heat panels, flex watt heat tape, which is under tank heating. So these snakes get a nice hot spot through their belly, radiates up through them. Very similar to if they were get overhead light, they would have a bulb or a heat emitter. It would radiate through their body. You could put a rock or something there, which would heat up first, and then the snake crawls on and basks. We're going to cover the fixtures of the enclosure later, but in general, the temperatures that you're going to try to hit, for the hot spot, I say target 88 to 95 degrees. Now, if this goes up to 100, you're fine. If this goes down to 85, you're okay. But that's the target. So what you really want to try to hit is that 88 to 95 degrees. I don't do a night drop. I don't recommend night drops. It overcomplicates things, and it's really not necessary in captivity. In the wild, it doesn't really occur. If you go to these natural habitats, it's hot all year, all day. It doesn't matter whether you're out at midnight or you're out at 6 in the morning or 12 in the afternoon. It's still really hot, specifically when you go into coverage and you're not in the direct sunlight. The temperature's fairly constant from day to night. So don't worry too much about a night drop. I used one years ago, and then since then I never did, and it never provided any beneficial care that I've been able to find. Your target cool end temperature, I usually say don't go below 75. 75 really is the number that you want to try to avoid. I say target 78 to 82. That's your target. Now, it is important to give them a cool end. My cages will naturally give that gradient. If I have my hotspot at 90 degrees, my cool end is probably 80 degrees. I have this 10-degree gradient. Now, for breeding and stuff like that, this is going to change, and you can fluctuate your temperatures, but in reality, I fluctuate them within that somewhat of a range. One of the next most important elements of snake care and boa care is humidity. Humidity is extremely important for this animal's health, for their respiratory tract, and everything that this animal does, it needs a humid environment. These are tropical animals, and they need the humidity there. You're going to be shooting for around 60 to 75% on average. If it goes higher than that, it's fine. If it goes lower than that, it's fine. But that's the target you're going to try to hit all year round. Now, for breeding, you may want to fluctuate that. Generally, the rainy season is also associated with those warmer summer months, and then the cooler months tends to be the drier season. So if you are trying to breed, you spike your humidity in the hot times and you lower it down in the cool times. You really need to make sure that these guys get that target humidity somewhere at that range the majority of the time, or you're going to start seeing stuck sheds and things like that. Now, boas are very hardy species, and they really don't get super impacted in short-term peaks and troughs of humidity, but long-term super humid or super dry, that's when you're going to start to see the side effects of improper humidity for these guys. Now we get into the fun stuff, the fixings. What do you actually put in the enclosure? Step one, first thing you need is some type of a substrate. I personally prefer cocoa substrate, which is like cocoa chips, cocoa blocks. You can mix it with other stuff, but really substrate is your choice. It's whatever you like and whatever you want to hit the requirements of these animals. So for that instance, that could be newspaper, it could be astroturf, it could be aspen bedding, it could be cocoa substrate, or just soil and dirt. You can use it all. It's all fine, it's all okay, it's all safe as long as it's free of pesticides. Most of the stuff you're going to find at pet stores are free. The only time you may get pesticides and fertilizers is if you start using garden soil and stuff like that from Home Depot or a similar hardware store. Use what you want, but this does play a role in humidity. And why I prefer cocoa substrate is you can spray that stuff down, and the cocoa seems to act like a sponge, which will slowly release the water over time. In combination with the heat, hits that humidity. It's very important to understand that there is a difference between wet and humid. Now, wet just means you sprayed it down. That is wet. That's not humidity. Humidity is the actual moisture in the air. Now, that's important to note because when you use substrates like paper towels or astroturf, you can't just wet them down and spray the snake's cage and say, I just peaked my humidity. Those are going to dry out very quickly, or you're going to get them so wet that they're just going to be wet and it's not going to be humid. That's very important to note, and that's why I prefer this cocoa bedding. You could also use cypress mulch, which is excellent. It doesn't mold very easily. If you ask me, I would recommend cocoa. I think it's really good stuff, great for spot cleaning, fairly inexpensive, and it's a substrate that will hold humidity really well. Before we switch topics on substrate, one thing you do need to note is the type of heat that you're using. So under tank heat emitters are generally going to be muffled by the substrate. You need to be really careful as you're checking the temperatures of your enclosure and of the belly tank. So for instance, if you're using a glass aquarium with an under tank heater, on top of your substrate may be perfect temperature, but if you move that substrate out of the way, that glass might be super hot. This goes for all enclosure types using under tank heaters, but substrate will generally muffle that. On the flip side, newspaper generally does not offer any muffling or insulation effects. Watch your temps, make sure that you're not overheating or underheating your cage based on your substrate. The next piece we need to talk about is what you now put on top of the substrate. What are your fixings? I always say at a bare minimum, if you're not using a rack like this, the two things that are absolutely essential are a water bowl and a hide box. One of the most important things your snake is going to need is water and access to fresh water. Now you should change this fairly often. I tend to do my water changes once or twice a week, and that's pretty good because my snakes won't generally defecate in their water bowls. So every other day, every day, I try to come down here, I open up all the bins. Are their waters good? Is there anything in the cage that I need to spot clean out? And if they're all good, they're good to go. But if there's something, if the water gets dirty, if they push some of the substrate in the water, I'll pull that water, change it. So that's why I say generally about once or twice a week I change this. Once a week, every week, I go through and give them all fresh water, disinfect their bowls, fill the water back up, and we're all good to go. The next thing that they need is a hide. In racks like this, the rack is generally a very secure space for these animals. They don't really need hides. Will they use it? Some of them will, some of them won't. I have hides, and I find that they don't use them. They sit on top of them, they sit next to them, they sit adjacent to them, but for the most part, 90% of my animals don't use them. Now, if you have something that's larger, a 2-foot tall enclosure, a 4-foot tall enclosure, you're going to need a hide. Now, a hide doesn't need to be a hide like what you would typically see in a pet store. It doesn't need to be that cork bark that's this hollow log or anything crazy. It could be a whole bunch of crumpled newspaper. It could be a cardboard box. It could be a whole bunch of plants pushed up against the corner. And that's what's cool about the hide, is you can almost decorate to make your hides what you want them. One thing about a hide that is very important, and a lot of people make as a common mistake, is a hide needs to feel tight and secure. Now, the common pet store stuff that you'll see in those aquarium kits is they give you this hide that's this hollow cork bark, and there's this tiny little snake sitting inside of it. A little snake sitting inside of a giant hide box is not a hide to them. A hide, they need to feel secure, they need to feel tight. They should be able to feel contact with almost their whole body. So a hide for a small snake, or a snake like this, would almost be like maybe a bin like this, a little bit smaller. So again, this size snake, a bin a little bit smaller than this that's black, could cover the snake up. They really need to feel a contact with their body. Contact with their body is the most important piece of a hide. Otherwise, don't even use it. You're wasting your time and your money. They need to feel that secureness in order for it to be effective. I somewhat kind of touched on this, but the last piece about an enclosure is generally the fixtures of the furniture. This could be things from vines to branches to different logs and trees and all kinds of stuff. Keep in mind that live plants are really cool, but a boa is going to destroy them. So if you want to use live plants, you need to make sure that they're sturdy, hard live plants. The other thing is you don't want the snake climbing on that live plant, having it tip over and have them hurt themselves. Snakes think that everything is a solid, hard fixture, or it's like it is in the wild. So my arm is a branch. If this branch breaks, the snake goes tumbling down, there's another branch to catch it. In an enclosure, if your log slips, the snake may fall and whack its head on the cage, and that could cause a lot of damage to the animal. So make sure that anything you put in an enclosure is as sturdy as it can be, or don't include it. Next up is lighting. Lighting is fairly important for boas. I just moved into my new building a couple of years ago, and the first thing that I noticed is it's really dark in here. If I hit all these lights, it would be almost pitch black with the exception of a couple tiny windows. From a temperature, humidity standpoint, this place is fantastic. From a lighting standpoint, it's really bad. So what I did is I have lights that are overhead and they go on timers. They don't provide any UVB or anything special like that. Generally, boas don't need that. I've kept boas 30 years old and they never had a UVB in their life. They never showed any side effects of being ill, sick, or unhealthy. UVB is not generally there, but I do feel it's important for them to get a day-night cycle. And what you will notice is if you just get natural sunlight, if you put a snake near a window, that's very cool. It's good enough. They don't need anything supplemental. Can you give it to them? Absolutely. If you want to, go for it. Just make sure your temperatures are not affected, specifically if it's just a supplemental light. Lights do give off heat, and different light bulbs give off different temperatures. You don't need a special bulb. You can go get an LED from Home Depot or Lowe's or your local hardware store, or you can get one of those flood bulbs, which will also give off heat. Just make sure that it is a flood bulb. You don't want to use spot bulbs for anything that's going to give off a heat. Spot will give a focus beam and can easily burn your snake. So first and foremost, make sure that your lights, if you're going to use them, are not giving off any temperature. Or if they do, that temperature is accounted for and safe for your animal. This includes windows. Make sure that that window is not giving off sun to the enclosure at any point in the day. If you put an enclosure near a window and that sunlight comes through, it could overheat your enclosure very quickly. Snakes do okay if they're a little bit colder. When you overheat them, they do not last long. Now that we've covered pretty much everything about a boa, the next thing I want to talk about is feeding. I have a whole dedicated video on that, so this is going to be an abbreviated feeding video. Essentially, pick something that is about as girthy as the snake's body and feed that at the appropriate schedule. The appropriate schedule is going to range based on the age of your animal. I generally say for a young animal, a newborn baby, let's say from 0 to 1 year old, once a week, something that is small, something that barely puts a lump in the snake. That would be weekly. If you are putting a lump in the snake, bump it to every 10 days to 2 weeks for that same size animal. As this animal grows, generally 1 to 3 years old, I say feed them something, again, that puts a tiny lump in the snake's body, tiny lump, so this might be a medium or a large rat, depending on where you get your feeders, and I feed that every 2 weeks for females and males about the same. Once they break that 3-year mark and they become what I would consider out of that sub-adult range and they're adults, about every 3 to 4 weeks is what you're going to target. If you're breeding, you may want to increase that for your females, so let's say every 2 to 3 weeks at most. I would never go faster than 2 weeks as an adult animal unless you're feeding something really small. And then for males, I usually keep it about every 3 weeks throughout the year. That tends to suit them very well. Then they may skip some meals here and there. If I have them breeding, they may skip that whole feeding. If they're looking kind of heavy, this goes for all ages, they're looking like they're digesting or shedding, I may skip that meal. It's okay to skip meals, and it's okay to vary your schedule. These are general rules and guidelines. If you want a more in-depth feeding video, go check out that video. I made it. I made 2 of them. I might have made 3 of them at this point. It's really good to go understand your feeding of your animal. That's what I recommend. There's a lot of ways to get from point A to B. And the very last thing that I think is really important is general cage care, disinfection, and maintenance. So I tend to use chlorhexidine. You can use bleach, you can use F10, vinegar, whatever you want. Just make sure that you're getting in that cage and cleaning it out as needed. Now with beddings, maybe you don't need to do that as much. So with the cocoa substrate, for instance, if they defecate in the corner, I might overscoop that corner, give it a little wipe with a chlorhexidine rag, and then put some new substrate on top of it. You're good to go. My bowls, I'll pull them, I'll soak them in chlorhexidine for a second, then I'll wipe them all down with some rags, then I will wash them off, put them back into the enclosure. Now, if you're using newspaper, which I used to do very often, is I would pull all the newspaper, I'd take my chlorhexidine rag, which was sitting in a bucket of chlorhexidine, I wipe down that whole enclosure really well, then I put some new newspaper down, replace my bowls, fixtures, and you're good to go. So that's it. I hope you all enjoyed the heck out of this video. I hope you do agree that this is the most complete boa care video on YouTube. If not, let me know in the comments who did it better. I want to see it. I want to watch it myself, regardless if it was the most complete or not. If you're interested, check out my website for available animals. Check out my Patreon if you want to join a community. Really cool monthly group chats and one-on-one chats we can have there. And until next video, let's keep it moving. Thanks, guys.